Once upon a time, there was a man. A man by the name of Disney. No, not that one. That's the one. And he had a dream: to uphold the legacy of his Uncle Walt and continue the tradition of hand-drawn feature animation at Disney Animation Studios. There were those who had stood in his way before, but a new foe lay before him. The one and only Michael Eisner. So, following the commercial failure of Fantasia 2000, as well as a subsequent string of animated feature films that were either box office disappointments or outright disasters, Eisner's attitude towards the profitability of feature animation soured, and with it, his relationship with Roy Disney. As a result, Disney Animation Studios started the process of abandoning traditionally animated films and began pumping out CGI films that sucked, but turned a profit in a blatant attempt to chase what seemed an inescapable fact. 2D animation is out, 3D animation is in. This stoked tensions between Disney and Pixar as well, then an independent company. At the same time, Eisner is busy making enemies with basically all of Disney's creative partners at Pixar, notably Ed Catmull, John Lasseter, and Steve Jobs. Combine all this with a series of pretty unwise investments and business decisions, and things were not looking good for our guy, Mike. In a bid to preserve the legacy of hand-drawn animation and salvage relations with Pixar, Roy resigns from the company and plots a coup to oust Eisner under the Save Disney campaign. And through a series of events that we won't get into here for time's sake, Eisner is ultimately ousted from Disney and replaced by the boring, competent Bob Iger, who swiftly sent the company into damage control. Eager to rebuild the bridges that had been burned, Iger organizes the acquisition of Pixar by Disney to the tune of $7.4 billion and leaves John Lasseter and Ed Catmull not only in charge of Pixar, but of feature animation as a whole at Disney. With Lasseter in charge of feature animation, he was determined to bring the studio back to its heyday and revive 2D animation, fulfilling Roy Disney's dream, even bringing back Disney veterans John Musker and Ron Clements to write and direct a new film. And lo, from the years of tumult between these warring factions was at last born Disney's latest opus, The Princess and the Frog, a film that was to be returned to the glory of the Renaissance years, a modern-day classic, a roaring success for the studio, and prove once and for all that hand-drawn animation was still a viable and profitable medium. And it did okay. This film is not awful. On its own merits, it's perfectly serviceable, and a welcome throwback to the Broadway-style Disney musical fairy tales of decades past. Not a Little Mermaid, and certainly not a Beauty and the Beast level success, but also not a Home on the Range level misfire. It's just kinda alright. So if you're expecting one of those
"This movie's trash and here's why"
WWE SmackDown style videos, yeah, sorry to disappoint. But with everything that was riding on this movie, just kinda alright was never going to cut it. This film not only had to contend with competing 3D animated films, but suffered from a slew of controversies throughout pre-production, with it facing accusations of racism, insensitivity to Hurricane Katrina victims, to the original title, The Frog Princess, being a slur against the French? Yes, apparently that happened.
Bonjour, you cheese-eating surrender monkeys!
But Princess and the Frog also had the misfortune of being put in the unenviable position of savior of 2D animation. And so this narrative around its production formed. If it fails, 2D feature animation as an art form fails with it.
We knew the importance of this film that we were making and the idea that we were trying to show the world why hand-drawn animation should come back.
No pressure! But let's put aside all of the context surrounding this film's production. Let's just talk about the film itself. Because while heightened and or unrealistic expectations didn't exactly help Princess and the Frog's case, the fact remains that this movie does have a lot of problems.
Get it down! Get it down!
That's what I'm here to talk about. We're gonna get to the bottom of why The Princess and the Frog underperformed. Before we get to all the nagging, in the interest of fairness, I want to briefly recap what works in this movie. Because there's actually a lot here to like, the much touted return to 2D animation being chief among them. It's a gorgeous film, and the return to hand-drawn after years of nothing but CGI is incredibly refreshing. It really is incredible to see how far the studio has come since its last forays in the medium. It wouldn't be much of a stretch to say it's visually one of Disney's finest efforts. And while this movie is very obviously harkening back to the Disney Renaissance, there's still some elements that set it apart from those films. Some for better.
I was starting to think that wishing on stars was just for babies and crazy people.
Some for worse.
One more time, it don't matter what you look like. It don't nobody gonna think we okay.
We'll get to that. Setting the film in Roaring 20s era New Orleans is an inspired choice and allows the film to go into creative territories uncharted by previous Disney movies. And I'd be remiss to not point out the elephant in the room, which is that this movie features the first ever black Disney princess. Charlotte is one of the biggest surprises the film has to offer.
Travis, when a woman says later, she really means not ever. Now run along. There are plenty of young fillies dying for you to waltz them into a stupor.
A spoiled, sweet Southern belle who steals every scene she's in and demonstrates some of the most entertaining character animation in the entire movie.
Well, back into the fray.
And like basically every other person, I'm a fan of Dr. Facilier. To this day, he's still the most memorable Disney villain since the 90s, and his suave yet menacing demeanor is great.
How y'all doing?
Also, his villain song is awesome.
Transformation Central! Transformation Central!
Not to mention his sentient shadow, which the animators have a lot of fun with. Anika Noni Ross is a great singer and elevates pretty much every song that she's in. And man, do these songs need some elevation.
When we're human, and we're gonna be, I'm gonna blow my horn!
I like Mama Odie.
We don't want to take up too much of your time.
Y'all want some candy?
Also, Naveen is hot. What?
Come, we pucker. That's new.
And with the film's return not only to hand-drawn animation, but also to a big Broadway-style musical, the first since Home on the Range, and the first straight-up fairy tale since Beauty and the Beast, the film just feels very cozy.
So really the approach to the animation is the same as it was done doing Aladdin and Little Mermaid, and now this is sort of a return to that.
Again, it's very intentionally evoking the nostalgia of the Disney Renaissance while still being a distinct film in its own right. And that sense of comfort goes a long way to making for an enjoyable viewing experience. But once you get past the coziness of it all, you start to notice problems. Like, why isn't this film resonating with me more? Why am I kinda restless watching all these Bayou antics go on? Why am I not having more fun, movie? And while some will point to the music not being very good, which...
We're gonna take it down, we're gonna take it down, we're gonna take it all the way down.
It isn't. Or the comedy being a little too childish and slapstick, which... yeah, it is. Or the race elements not being handled very well, which... yeah, we'll get to that. But my main issues with this movie pertain mostly to narrative, character, and motivation. And these problems manifest in a variety of ways throughout the film. So, why don't we dig a little deeper? Here a sidekick, there a sidekick, 2 animal sidekicks, 1 human sidekick. The villain has a sidekick. Even the sidekicks have sidekicks. Sidekicks have a long and storied history in Disney movies. Sometimes they're the best part of the film.
Smaller than my last master. Either that or I'm getting bigger. Look at me from the side. Do I look different to you?
Other times, less so.
Pour the wine and cut the cheese!
But the best sidekicks exist to fulfill some sort of narrative function, complementing the motivation of the protagonist or providing some much-needed levity.
That fez and vest combo is much too 3rd century. These patches, what are we trying to say? Beggar? No.
Or alternatively, they can completely clash with the tone of the film.
I'm losing to a bird!
Or sometimes they're just cute and there to peddle merchandise. Genie is not only the source of most of the laughs and voiced by a prolific comedian, but directly ties into Aladdin's growth as a character.
No matter what anybody says, you'll always be a prince to me.
Mushu, like Mulan, is underestimated by everyone and determined to prove himself to her ancestors.
Dishonor on your whole family. Make a note of this. Dishonor on you.
And is also voiced by a prolific comedian. Notice a trend. The Princess and the Frog has a lot of characters in addition to its main two that it attempts to juggle, and it does not do so very successfully. Contrast this to a film like Beauty and the Beast. Sure, there are a lot of side characters. Mrs. Potts, Chip, Lumiere, Cogsworth, the Wardrobe, Plumette, the Oven Chef. But while they all have distinct personalities, they are all united by a common goal, which is clear from the outset. To get Belle and the Beast to fall in love and lift the curse. Like that's it. Okay, great, got it. It's simple and ties directly into the main conflict. Here, all of these characters have wildly different motivations, and not many of them tie into the central story in a clear or satisfying way. So outside of our breeding pair, we have Charlotte, who wants to marry a prince, Naveen's put upon double-crossing valet Lawrence, who wants to reverse his fortune and live the good life, Louis the alligator, who wants to be human so he can play in a jazz band.
I want fingers and toes and a belly button. Not the kind that sticks out, but the kind that goes in.
And of course, there's Ray.
You mean?
Who... honestly, I have no idea what purpose Ray serves or why he's following them. Which then raises the question, why are they even here aside from, appealing to kids and adding butt jokes?
I just got my big butt glowing, that's right. Ooh, women like a man with a big fat pouch.
Just side note, this might be the most butt jokes I've ever encountered in a Disney movie. Louis is fun, but his motivation to become human only gives him a reason to take Tiana and Naveen to Mama Odie, and then for the rest of the film, he's just there. Lawrence is a totally passive pawn in Facility's scheme and sucks. Ray serves no purpose to the story except to give us a heroic death, and... yeah, this scene is, it's a lot for this character. This bug gets a damn funeral procession for fuck's sake. The problem isn't simply that there are too many characters, although that is certainly a problem. It's that they aren't woven into the narrative as deftly as necessary, and therefore they add very little to the film. Their motivations are either weak or completely unrelated to the main narrative, which makes them not only utterly superfluous characters, aka bad sidekicks, but also leaves the movie feeling way more bloated than it should, considering it barely ekes out at over an hour-and-a-half runtime. They are empty screenplay calories. But they provide us with butt jokes, so thanks, I guess. The Princess and the Frog has a unique problem in which some of its greatest assets, butt joke, are also some of its biggest issues. Alright, let's talk about Charlotte. Sweet, sweet Charlotte.
Daddy, stop the car!
She's so lovable. She's so woke and progressive despite being a high society debutante living in Jim Crow era Louisiana. I'm not saying that her friendship with Tiana is totally unrealistic for the era. Only, kind of. The biggest issue with Charlotte is not exactly her whiteness. Well, it's not just her whiteness, but her wealth. This is a problem because the crux of Tiana's conflict at the beginning of the film is not having enough money to start her restaurant. This issue is then temporarily resolved when Charlotte just hands her a fat wad of cash in exchange for some
man kitchen beignets. This is it. I'm getting my restaurant.
But then, uh-oh, wouldn't you know, someone outbid Tiana and her dream is crushed. Do you see the problem with this? Okay, to be fair, it's pretty heavily implied that Tiana doesn't ask for much from Charlotte because she has too much pride and values hard work and getting the restaurant through her own sweat and blood. Great. but she has no problem with Charlotte clearly overpaying her to cater a party with some pastries. So surely she could just get Charlotte to help her out a bit more? Surely she'll need some more
A man catching beignets
in the future, right? There's also the fact that the entire time Tiana is struggling and busting her ass, and meanwhile Charlotte is apparently just oblivious to this, which undermines the genuinely sweet characterization the film was going for. Maybe a quick scene in which Tiana refuses Charlotte's financial help would have, well, helped. But even then, this money conflict is kind of weak when there's an out just standing there and Tiana's stubbornness and pride are the only things stopping her. Take that honky's money! But perhaps even more frustrating is Dr. Facilier. And this is where we start to get into the nitty-gritty of the structural issues with this movie.
I'm a royal myself on my mother's side.
Like Hades before him, Facilier has the problem of having, at best, a tertiary relationship to the protagonist. Disney villains are typically one-dimensional and usually just coast on personality, which makes them so memorable. This works in early Disney films because they were typically simple good versus evil fairy tales. The Disney Renaissance would complicate this narrative by throwing in the protagonist's internal conflict, the search for identity, a trend that The Princess and the Frog carries on. The classic Disney villain, one-dimensional, obviously evil, charismatic, can still work in these stories, but they only work best when their motivations come into direct confrontation with the hero's internal and external conflicts. Ursula works great because she exploits both Ariel's frustration with her father and Triton's love for Ariel. Gaston works so well because he is a perfect foil to the Beast. Beautiful on the outside, but hideous on the inside.
He's no monster, Gaston. You are.
Drag him, Belle! Drag him! So what's Facilier's deal? Rather than his goals directly interfering with Tiana's, his whole evil plot involves, rather convolutedly I might add, turning Naveen into a frog, replacing him with an imposter Naveen to be his puppet, marrying imposter Naveen to Charlotte and then taking the LaBeouf family fortune to repay his debts to the dark spirits he made a deal with, and then terrorizing all of New Orleans. Okay. How does this tie into Tiana and her restaurant? It doesn't, at all. None of this has anything to do with Tiana except through sheer happenstance when she is turned into a frog when she kisses Naveen, which isn't explained at all in a movie that's pretty explainy of its fantastical elements, but whatever, fine.
Hush up and look at the gumbo.
So the conflict between Facilier and Tiana is entirely incidental, which makes for a weak sauce dynamic between the two. And when they finally do meet, it just feels hollow. Suddenly he's reciting Tiana's entire life story to her like he knows her, but he doesn't.
And don't forget your poor daddy. Never letting on how bone-tired and beat down he really was. Shame all that hard work didn't amount to much more than a busted-up old gumbo pot and a dream that never got off the back porch.
There's nothing to this confrontation because they haven't built up any sort of rapport leading up to this moment. It's literally the first time they're on screen together. And this has nothing to do with Facilier's goals. I guess they're kinda going for this contrast between the two, with Tiana never taking any shortcuts and always believing in honest work to achieve her goals, while Facilier is duplicitous and uses witchcraft and schemes to achieve his. But that's subtext at best, and it's still a pretty rickety foundation to build upon. So yeah, Dr. Facilier is fun and a nice throwback to the classic Disney villain, sure, but his connection to Tiana's story is flimsy and his motivation is weak. Which brings us to... Okay, well I guess I should address the elephant in the room real quick. Is it time to open this can of worms already? So suffice to say, this movie has some issues when it comes to the subject of race. Oh, Disney. I'm not going to belabor this point too much because there is a lot that can be said about this topic. One could focus an entire video essay on The Princess and the Frog and its depiction of race, but that's not what I'm focusing on here. Furthermore, as a white and someone not the most well-versed on critical race theory, I don't think I can really do that conversation justice. So for brevity's sake, and to not make a complete ass of myself, consider this merely a sampler of the discourse. When it comes to representation of race, Disney's track record has been historically mixed. So naturally, when you have a company like Disney releasing a film focusing on a historically marginalized group, a lot of people start to get nervous. And as I mentioned earlier, Princess and the Frog was hit with controversy right out of the gate for this very reason. But now that the dust has settled around this movie, I want to take some time to address some of the criticisms that have persisted over the years. Let's start with the criticism that most people are familiar with, that being the animal transformation aspect of the plot.
How'd you get way up there? And how'd I get way down here and all this?
Throughout the aughts, there was an oddly specific trend of Disney movies with people of color as the protagonist, which involved them turning into animals for some reason. As seen in The Emperor's New Groove.
Okay,
llama. Llama face.
Brother Bear.
Just, ow, stop that. Oh, if you just, ow.
And, of course, The Princess and the Frog.
That is not slime.
What?
You are secreting mucus.
Interesting. And if you know your history, you know that comparisons of people of color to animals was and is still a thing, which makes for some pretty unfortunate implications. So, is this problematic? Well, I would argue that the case for Emperor's New Groove is pretty shaky, since Pacha is essentially the secondary protagonist and remains human throughout the movie and is, along with the rest of the human characters, as much an indigenous American as Cusco. The difference with Princess and the Frog is that both of our central characters are people of color and both of them are turned into frogs. And the only other major black characters in the film are Dr. Facilier, a witch doctor villain, literal magical Negro Mama Odie, and Tiana'S parents who get hardly any screen time. There's also the fact that Emperor's New Groove and its content and style is just so divorced from any specific culture or ethnicity and is so cartoonish and exaggerated that it can just get away with it more.
Pull the lever, Kronk.
The decision to set the story in South America almost comes across as incidental. But Princess and the Frog wants you to know what a milestone it is in representation of black people. It's as if Disney is saying, look how brave we are for finally having a black princess. Now quick, let's turn her into a frog for 80% of the movie. And it should go without saying that actually seeing black bodies on screen does matter. So to then have your black princess be a frog for most of the runtime just feels like a cop-out. And I don't want to hear, well, that's in the source material. It's based on the frog princess. What were they supposed to do? To that I say, bullshit. It's a Disney movie. They have the authority to change whatever they want. And they made the choice to have this be a story with black characters. And they made the choice to have those characters turn into frogs for most of the runtime. Just saying. And then there are the questions surrounding the character Naveen, whose race is ambiguous? Like, he's definitely not white, but what is he? He has a swarthy appearance, he has an Indian name, he's voiced by the Brazilian Bruno Campos, and he comes from a completely made-up place called Maldonia. So rather than having two identifiably black characters, one of them just exists on a plane of nondescript ethnic. And then there were the people upset by the fact that it was an interracial romance rather than a black couple, which, you know, I'm not gonna go there. Perhaps more frustrating though is this movie's bad tendency of kinda addressing racism, but you know, not too much. All the commentary on race relations at the time is mostly kept at the level of subtext and implications. We see Tiana and her mother riding in the back of the trolley, we see the neighborhood that Tiana and her family live in, which is clearly supposed to be that part of town, and is directly juxtaposed with Charlotte's mansion. And while these realtor dicks claim that someone outbid Tiana on the property, there's the pretty heavy implication that the reason they go with another offer is because they're kinda racist, which is supported by how condescending they behave in their interactions with her.
You know how long it took me to save that money?
Exactly. Which is why a little woman of your background would have had her hands full trying to run a big business like that.
But this is all still in the realm of subtext. And on the one hand, I get it. Like, one shouldn't expect a scathing critique of systemic oppression from a Disney film. Granted. But the film also goes so out of its way to sugarcoat the time period by showing black and white characters together in harmony, or by presenting Charlotte and her father as being just that nice and sympathetic. See, they're so progressive. Race? I don't see race. I'm colorblind. Segregation? Never heard of it. Is that some kind of sauce? The film boils down issues of race and class to characteristics that are only openly acknowledged by bad people, like the realtors, while good people, like Charlotte, are able to see past that, which erases the extremely insidious and complex nature of institutional racism. Racism is never and has never been as simple as a couple bad apples. That doesn't make for a tidy narrative. As such, the film's treatment of race can't help but read as kinda disingenuous. To be fair, I'm not totally sure what Disney should have done differently. I mean, this is a Disney movie. Whitewashed history is pretty much part and parcel of the Disney oeuvre. Though the most obvious solution in my mind would have been to simply remove the white characters, or at least to keep the focus on a black community. After all, Disney had done this before in films like Brother Bear, and would go on to do so in Moana, circumnavigating this particular issue. Instead, we're left with a movie that touches on race and uses diversity as one of its major marketing draws without ever really reckoning with it. Bringing the issue of race up might seem like something of a non sequitur when we're talking about the narrative shortcomings of this movie, but it's impossible to untangle the race element from the narrative elements, as the film's racial fumblings do directly impact the narrative, as seen with Charlotte. And how films are willing to depict issues of race affect what narratives we're willing to tell, and vice versa. Had Disney chosen to present a fairy tale focused solely on black characters, that likely would have resulted in a very different movie. But because the template is still cookie-cutter Renaissance-era Disney, the film is limited in what it is willing to do. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's get back to the fun stuff. In screenwriting, a character's motivation is often described in terms of dramatic want versus need. This can also be thought of as a conscious desire versus a subconscious desire, or an external goal versus an internal goal. Typically, the want is usually established near the beginning of the story and is the protagonist's initial motivation. It could be riches,
live in a palace, and never have any problems at all.
Or it could be to keep your status at the top of the toyarchy.
That wasn't flying, that was falling with style.
Or it could be to find your fish son.
They took my son! My son! Help me, please!
But over the course of the story, the protagonist realizes their need, or subconscious desire, which usually becomes clear around the third act. The two may be related and usually complement each other, but typically they're not the same thing. The beast's want is to become human, but his need is to learn kindness and to put someone else's needs before his own.
I let her go.
Yes, Splend... You... What?
I had to, because I love her.
After his father's death and fleeing the Pride Lands, Simba's want is to escape his past.
I can't go back.
Why?
You wouldn't understand.
You're our only hope.
But his need is to accept responsibility and defend his home from Scar. Disney movies make for good case studies because they aren't terribly subtle about character motivation. There's a reason they're called I Want songs. Dig a Little Deeper is basically Want versus Need, the song. In which Mama Odie basically just spells out that Naveen and Tiana's more immediate desires will not fulfill them in the long term, nor resolve their deeper issues.
You wanna be rich again? That ain't gonna make you happy now. Did it make you happy then? No! All you need is some self-control. Make yourself a brand new start. Y'all want to be human, but you're blind to what you need.
Honestly, Mama Odie should just teach screenwriting 101. Fuck Sid Field. So, what is Tiana's want? She wants her damn restaurant, which is made abundantly clear from the outset by her own I Want song, Almost There. But not only does she just want a restaurant, oh no, she wants to know that she's worked for it, and in doing so, honored her father's memory. And that's a solid foundation for her character. It's certainly a more clearly defined desire than a lot of other Disney princesses who wanted adventure in the great wide somewhere, or boys. Just boys. But what is Tiana'S unconscious desire? What is her need?
I need to dig a little deeper and work even harder to get my restaurant.
No, Tiana, that is not your need. And honestly, this is kinda where the movie loses me. Throughout the film, characters are telling Tiana that she works too hard.
Girl, all you ever do is work. But it's a shame you working so hard.
Her mother, her friends, which, as far as flaws go, is a pretty minor one. That's like the major flaw of the main character in a bad Hallmark movie. Like, girl, you work too hard. You need to get away from your busy job as a marketing consultant and go on vacation somewhere in middle America where you can meet a salt-of-the-earth carpenter who doesn't care about materialism and live happily ever after. Man, I wish my main flaw was working too hard instead of being a bitter defeatist with no self-esteem. Okay, so if we're to believe the film, Tiana isn't already self-actualized at the start of the film. She has a lesson she needs to learn in order to grow. And that lesson is basically, stop working your life away and trying to fulfill your father's dream and instead try to enjoy your own damn life.
My daddy never did get what he wanted. But he had what he needed.
Again, in theory this is fine, but in practice, Tiana's self-actualization basically amounts to settling down with a guy, which is best exemplified in this scene.
My dream wouldn't be complete without you in it.
This is, yes, problematic. But more than anything, it just makes for a pretty weak resolution to her character arc. Her trying to follow in her father's footsteps and open the restaurant he wanted to open isn't ever framed as a problem. Instead, the problem is her just not getting a guy to share it with.
It's all I want for you, sweetheart. To meet your Prince Charming and dance off into your happily ever after.
Like, if the lesson was, hey, Tiana, you can't spend your life trying to realize your father's dream and instead need to carve out your own path, that would be a pretty compelling arc. But by the end of the film, she's gotten her man and her restaurant, and the movie treats this as a happy ending. In contrast to Tiana, Naveen's character arc is actually much tighter and has the added benefit of tying into Facilier's motivation as well. Naveen wants to return to his life of luxury and lady killing, but his need is to grow the fuck up, stop relying on his parents, and make a name for himself.
This stick in the mud has had to work 2 jobs her whole life while you've been sucking on a silver spoon, chasing chambermaids around your ivory tower.
And also find a girl to settle down with. This is much more compelling since most people could probably agree that Naveen at the beginning of the film is kind of a fuckboy who does have some legitimate character flaws that he needs to grow beyond.
I admit it was a charmed life until the day my parents cut me off, and suddenly I realized I don't know how to do anything.
But this isn't Naveen's story, it's Tiana's. Okay, well, it's kinda his story too, but it's mostly hers. This ties into a wider trend we've seen in Disney's recent output, the need to have developed female and male characters so as to cater to a broader demographic. This isn't inherently a problem, but as a result of giving Naveen a greater role in the story, it dilutes what should be Tiana's story, and we're left with an antagonist who is more or less tangential to her character. There's a disconnect between Tiana, Naveen, and Facilier's roles in the story, and the film never successfully bridges those gaps. And this is what really drags the film down. The conflicts, both external and internal, and the resolutions to said conflicts just aren't very dramatically satisfying, and that isn't helped out by poorly sketched out characters with weak motivations. Ultimately, this movie has a lot of interesting ideas, but those ideas deserve to belong to a better movie. Charlotte is a riot, but puts a spotlight on the film's questionable relationship with race. Dr. Facilier is fun and menacing, but his motivation is weak and his connection to Tiana is tenuous at best. Finally, having a black Disney princess was long overdue, but unfortunately Tiana is a pretty bland protagonist. There are a couple alright songs,
Almost there.
but they're drowned out in the Randy Newman-ness of the rest of the soundtrack.
Going down the bayou, going down the bayou, going down the bayou.
I appreciate that this movie exists. I appreciate that the filmmakers tried to capture the magic of the Disney Renaissance with this movie. But in the end, it falls just short of those lofty standards. At least we'll always have the butt jokes. Obviously, the issues with The Princess and the Frog and the reason for its underperformance extend beyond just the screenplay or the music or it being hand-drawn or even its racial politics. The holiday season at the box office in 2009 was notably very crowded, with Sherlock Holmes and the Twilight Saga New Moon coming out around the same time. And everyone and their grandma was going to see cultural juggernaut Avatar. Speaking of, remember Avatar? Me neither. Even the critically reviled Alvin and the Chipmunks, the Squeakquel, managed to gross double what The Princess and the Frog earned domestically. Yeah, that happened.
Hey! Look out!
Alvin!
Disney would later acknowledge that they had made missteps with The Princess and the Frog, particularly in the marketing. According to Ed Catmull, including the word princess in the title pushed away the male demographic. So if you're wondering why most of the Disney princess movies since have had adjective titles, that's why. But in true Disney fashion, not all of the lessons learned were necessarily the right ones. Because The Princess and the Frog underperformed, the message to the higher-ups was clear. Hand-drawn animation is dead. It couldn't have been that the film maybe just wasn't that great, or that the music wasn't memorable, or that the release schedule for the fourth quarter was way overcrowded. And it definitely couldn't have had anything to do with racism, right? Sadly, as a result, this film did not usher in a second hand-drawn Disney renaissance as John Lasseter had hoped. The only hand-drawn film that followed was the massively underrated 2011's Winnie the Pooh.
Can you tie a knot?
I cannot.
Ah, so you cannot.
No, I cannot not.
Not?
Who's there?
Pooh?
Pooh who?
No.
Which I encourage you to watch. It also had a lackluster performance, pretty much sealing the fate of hand-drawn feature animation at Disney. Yet, despite The Princess and the Frog being a disappointment, its legacy hasn't been all bad. Disney has seen something of a second renaissance since its release, with films such as Tangled, Frozen, and Moana all going on to be huge successes despite using the same basic template as Princess and the Frog. Except they were all 3D animated, and didn't have princess in the title. Also, they were all better films, TBH. And as a result of this film, millions of little black girls finally got to look up to and admire a Disney princess that looked like them. And problematic representation or no, the importance of that shouldn't be understated.
It is important as a culture, particularly in this nation where there are so many people of so many different shades of brown, to be able to go to a movie and see sparkles and fairy dust that falls on them too.
Looking back 7 years later, Lasseter told Variety, "I was determined to bring back hand-drawn animation because I felt it was such a heritage of the Disney studio, and I loved the art form. I was stunned that Princess didn't do better. We dug into it and did a lot of research and focus groups. It was viewed as old-fashioned by the audience." So in conclusion, I guess the studios are right. Hand-drawn animation is dead. Long live 3D.